So it was not the case that only the team with the most points would win. Instead, either or both groups could get prizes at the end of this task the more points they had. So there's no competition, and your job in this is simply to give your team the most points possible. That's the way to get the most reward. The most prizes is just to give your team the most possible points. The subjects in this task were given options, and they had to choose one option in terms of how many points they gave to their own team and the other team.
So here's an example here. I'll go back to the microphone in a second, but here, your group is on top, how many points your group will get. The other group is on the bottom, how many points they'll get. And you can only, when you make a choice, you choose one pair. And so the point here is that there are some choices where your group gets very little and the other group gets very little. But to give your group the most points, you also need to give the other group a lot of points too. So your choice was, do you give your team the most points possible while also giving the other team a lot of points? Or do you try to give the other team as few points as possible, but at the same time you end up giving your own team fewer points as well? Now the logical thing to do is to do something over here, because the task is set up such that all that matters is how many points your team has at the end. So by that token, you should just ignore what's on the bottom of the choices and give your team the most points. But what the boys systematically did, illogically, was they chose this. They basically chose the option that screwed the other team the most, even when it was definitely at the expense of their own team's performance.
So what the subjects chose here was to maximize the difference between their own group and the other group, basically to make sure that the other group was relatively deprived compared to their group, even though ultimately that was not a good strategy for their own team's performance, because the only good strategy was to get as many points as possible. So Tajfel argued that this reflected basically discrimination, that the subjects, just based on the creation of these minimal groups, they were meaningless. The boys were friends with each other and knew each other. They were told the group had no importance, but just by creating the groups and putting the kids into those two groups led to the group becoming salient and to what looked like discrimination between the groups. And Tajfel was a little bit neutral about why it would be the case that the mere formation of groups should lead to prejudice and stereotypes and discrimination. People have argued that maybe there's some evolved tendency to be very sensitive to who's with us and who's not with us. And evolutionary psychologists have come up with complicated stories as to why that would be adaptive, to be sensitive to group differences. And they may be somewhat compelling, but the point is, it's pretty stunning, I think, that we end up with prejudice and stereotypes even when the groups are meaningless. Not only are they created by random assignment, but they're not based on any important criteria at all. And that is sufficient to produce prejudice and discrimination, I think is pretty striking about the human tendency to be sensitive to group membership and to discriminate against groups that we're not a member of. Now, after Tajfel proposed minimal group theory, there was one explanation, a more sort of social psychological explanation was put forth to try to explain why it would be the case that people would discriminate based on minimal groups, and this is known as social identity theory. So social identity theory is not really a separate theory for minimal groups, and more as an explanation as to why minimal groups lead to prejudice. So it sort of fills in a mechanism that's not specified by the minimal groups approach. Basically, what social identity theory says is that the reason that we discriminate against other groups that we're not a member of is that it makes us feel better about ourselves because we derive status and self-esteem from the groups that we are a member of. So social identity theory says that our status and our feeling about ourselves is tied up in the groups that we're a member of. And as disturbing a fact as this may be, We feel good when groups that we're not a member of encounter negative situations, and we feel good when groups that we are a member of do better than groups that we're not a member of. It's pleasurable to us to be part of a winning group, and it's also pleasurable to us to not be part of a losing group. So social identity theory argues that prejudice and discrimination emerges from group membership just because we have this natural tendency to make ourselves feel better by degrading other groups that we're not a member of and upgrading groups that we are a member of. So let me tell you about one piece of evidence that, and again, this is disturbing, but it is something that we need to keep in mind when we think about ways of overcoming stereotypes and discrimination. What this experiment does is ask whether discriminating actually makes us feel better about ourselves. Here's how the study was done. Subjects were divided into Clay and Kandinsky groups using the minimal group paradigm. So half the subjects were told, based on random assignment, that they tended to prefer the artist Clay, the other half were told they prefer the artist Kandinsky. And then the subjects are given a task. Half the subjects are given a task like the one that schoolboys did, where they assign points to their own group and members of another group. The other half of subjects, instead of doing this point assignment group where they have the opportunity to discriminate against the other group, the other half of subjects were just given an irrelevant newspaper article to read. So this other group is basically not given an opportunity to discriminate. The dependent variable in the study is self-esteem at the end of the study, which was administered by questionnaire. Theoretically, because everybody was assigned to their condition based on random assignment, the levels of self-esteem naturally that these subjects walk around with should be equivalent regardless of condition. So any differences between conditions could be attributable to the effects of the manipulation. Here's what they found. The first is, like with the school kids, the subjects who were given the opportunity to assign points, they did show the in-group bias and out-group discrimination. They did make choices that would harm the other group. More importantly, for supporting social identity theory, though, what they found was that the subjects who discriminated, they were basically given the opportunity to discriminate by assigning points in this task. At the end of the study, they had higher self-esteem than the subjects who had just read the newspaper article. The only difference is that those subjects could discriminate, and people reading the newspaper article were reading a newspaper article and did not have the opportunity to engage in behavior having to do with group membership.